I walked in expecting a quiet dinner, not a confession. I saw my brother cradle my son like he'd always been his, and my wife's laugh hit a place in my chest that stopped time. In that moment I knew I had been living inside a lie someone else had written. I found out the way most people do when their world is already splintering, by accident, in a room that should have been ordinary. It was a late Sunday afternoon. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off a modem they hadn't figured out, and the house smelled like elderflower and the faint, familiar lemon polish my mother used on the dining table. My brother, Eric, was there. He popped in on weekends since his job was flexible, and my wife, Anna, had come straight from running errands, hair in a messy bun, cheeks flushed from cold air. My son, Jonah, toddled between the legs of furniture like he owned the world. I carried the box into the living room, said hello, and then I saw what changed everything, on the coffee table. A framed photo I had never put there, a photograph of Jonah on his first birthday inside a frame I recognized because I'd bought it 3 years prior for our mantel. The picture was recent. Jonah was laughing mid-blowout, frosting on his cheek, but the face next to him, smiling, leaning in with an arm protectively around Jonah's shoulders, was not mine. It was Eric's smile, the same crooked grin that broke out whenever he told a joke. The photo was candid, intimate, taken from the sort of angle only someone close would know to take. I set the modem down and my hands were very steady and very cold at the same time. I asked a casual question because confrontation is a luxury reserved for people whose lives aren't suddenly tilting. When was this taken? My mother, folding a napkin, looked up, blinked, and said, "Last month, at the birthday. I thought you liked the frame." My wife kept moving, pouring coffee like she had practiced normalcy her whole life. My brother smiled with the guilt-free ease of a man who hasn't yet been asked to explain himself. "We all pitched in to throw him a party," he said. It seemed right. I remember my voice then, flat, like someone reading a script. "Who took the picture?" Eric said, "A guy from work." The pause between the words stretched, and then my mother, who had always been practical and blunt, said, "No, dear, it was me." She laughed softly, and the laugh was what did it, the casual way she moved on, as if a detail could erase the accuracy of a photograph, never noticing the line of pain that had silently cracked across my face. I looked from the photograph to Jonah, to Eric, to Anna, and then the world rearranged itself into before and after. The before had been 10 years of a marriage, a house, mortgage payments, loyalties. The after was the recognition that truth sometimes arrives on glossy paper and sits on your table, while people sip tea like nothing has changed. I didn't shout. There was no cinematic collapse. I went home, set the frame on my own mantel, and waited until everyone had left before I called my sister-in-law's number from my phone, watched the call ring, then went upstairs and opened the drawer where Anna kept receipts and notes. I found a small folded envelope with a neat, looping handwriting I recognized immediately, Eric's. Inside were tickets for a concert 2 months earlier, a coffee shop receipt from the day before Jonah's party, and at the bottom, a short note, "Can't wait to see you this weekend. E." That smell of paper, faint perfume on the corner, was the particular, private kind of evidence that no one plans to find. I sat at the edge of our bed with the envelope in my lap until the house settled into night. And then I walked down the hall to the guest room where Jonah slept and watched him breathe as if the gentlest surveillance could keep him from being rearranged into someone else's future. I remember thinking, with a clarity that made my throat ache, that there are betrayals you can forgive and betrayals you cannot live with. This felt like the latter. The next morning I asked Anna if she wanted to go for coffee, small, neutral, an offer that felt like a test. She agreed. Over steaming cups in a place that smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar, I framed my question as tenderness because tenderness keeps people honest when they're afraid to be cruel. Who took Jonah's photo? She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and said things that were halves of truths. It was Eric. He's been more around. He helps. He takes photos. You're always at work. Her hands hovered over the mug. I let her fill the silence. She did, about long days, how exhausted she was, about how caring Eric had been since he got transferred across town. I wanted to be furious. Instead, I wanted to understand the map of how they'd stepped from careless comfort into a secret life. When she finally pushed back from the table and said, "I didn't mean for this to happen," the words arrived like someone fumbling to close a door that was already wide open. "It didn't happen," I said. "It was built." She blinked, and for the first time I saw fear, not for being found but for what naming the truth might cost. "How long?" I asked. She choked on the answer, the way a person chokes when they pull a splinter too roughly. 2 years, she said. 2 years. My son was 2. The world swam and came back into focus, sharp and unbearable. In that coffee shop, her hand found mine, and I felt every year we had folded into one another withdraw like breath. I told myself I would gather facts, not fury. I would be methodical because emotion makes people do things they regret, evidence makes people accountable. I went home and did something I'd avoided because I didn't want to be the person who cried over photos. I opened Eric's laundry basket and found a sweater with a thread of cake frosting on the cuff. I logged into our shared cloud and found a folder of pictures labeled Jonah's Day that included dozens of images of my son with Eric, the two of them carefree in frames no husband had been in. The photos were timestamped on days I had been late at work, nights I'd been on call. I sat on the floor with the evidence around me and felt the ground under me shift. Betrayal is loud when it's a slamming door. This was quieter and more dangerous because it wore the camouflage of family. Over the following week I watched them both with the patience of someone cataloging symptoms. I didn't confront them with anger the first time. I confronted with questions that revealed how carefully the story had been written. "Why did you buy Jonah that jacket?" Anna said it was a sale. Eric said I thought it looked good on him. That evening the three of us sat watching cartoons while Jonah devoured cereal, and I noticed the way Eric's hand lingered on the back of Anna's chair like a habit. The habit had become a claim. I asked my brother to lunch and he arrived with the same half-joke, half-charm persona he used to diffuse tension. I didn't let him turn it into banter. I put the photo on the table between us. He recognized it without looking. He put his head in his hands and said a single, small phrase, "I messed up." That confession was both confession and minimization, both truth and plea. He said it with the tiredness of a man who had practiced owning guilt while hoping for mercy. I told him I wanted to know names, dates, places. He told me the affair had started after a work crisis when Anna needed help. It was a sentence that could be told 1,000 ways: an emergency, a comfort, a mistake. But the sequence was clear. He had been the warm presence in the evenings, the one who answered texts when I was late, the one who showed up with coffee and a smile. The house had shifted imperceptibly toward him while I still paid the mortgage. My mother called it a convenience family. My father insisted on not getting involved. I felt alone in a room full of people who had chosen not to see. I asked them both to leave. They didn't understand why I couldn't pretend ignorance and still be a man who tolerated pain for the sake of appearances. I didn't want revenge. The idea of getting them to feel my pain felt petty and empty. I wanted clarity, restitution, a life for my son that wasn't tangled in the lies of two adults who thought they could hide behind his smile. They thought they were careful. They weren't. They thought their loyalty to each other would survive exposure. They were wrong. The next days slid into a legal haze I had no interest in navigating at that moment. I called a lawyer, not to burn bridges but to set boundaries, custody, visitation, and to ensure the child's security. Anna begged and cried in a way I had never seen her cry. The tears were raw, used up. Eric sat in the living room with his jaw clenched. The weight of a man who finally saw his life laid out like a ledger of bad choices. I slept in Jonah's room those nights because the house felt too loud with the absence of trust. I watched my son breathe and wondered how you explain to a toddler that his world now has more adults wearing the mask of guilt than there are reasons for it. I don't think I recognized the man I became in those months, meticulous, sharp, hard to please. I spent afternoons at a desk with a stack of photocopies that proved what I already knew. I found messages he'd accidentally forwarded to my number, screenshots Anna had sent herself, hospitality receipts, a rental agreement with Eric's name on it for a cabin they'd gone to in a weekend I had worked. Every item cut like a new incision. I stopped playing the part of husband who forgave easily. I stopped accepting the small lies that had once kept us together. My reaction was not theatrical. It was practical. I wanted a home that wasn't built on obfuscation. I wanted a father my son could trust who wasn't also his uncle's co-conspirator. When the lawyer said custody battles would be messy and slow, I felt a cold appreciation for the legal system for its glacial impartiality. I wanted something permanent in a life that had been altered by secrecy. I filed papers. It was not a dramatic exit. It was a ledger entry, a signature, a quiet declaration that the life we had before was over. They called me cruel, selfish, unforgiving. Neighbors asked awkward questions at barbecues. My parents tried to be neutral, and instead said the worst things by saying nothing. We moved through winter under the slick surface of moral ambiguity, with Jonah always at the center of a world that had split around him. I remember the day my mother begged me to reconsider, to think of the family. "You'll make a child hate you," she whispered, guilt wrapped in fear. I looked at Jonah and saw no hate. I saw an innocent soul whose life was a present, and not a punishment. I chose him. I told my mother she could keep her silence. Some silences are complicit. Some are survival. I didn't need either. That summer, the custody order was temporary and brutal in its clarity. I had primary physical custody. Anna was devastated in a private way that public displays couldn't comfort. Eric moved out. There was no shouting, no dramatic chase scenes. There was paper, signatures, and reality rearranged into new rooms and new routines. Jonah adapted with the bewildering resilience of children. He learned a new bedtime story with a different father figure in the evenings, and in the mornings he still crawled into my lap for cartoons. He had no memory of a betrayal that looked like anything other than adults learning to be more honest. The long aftermath was less sensational than I imagined. No grand acts of retribution. No explosive public exposures. The sort of justice I wanted was quieter, legal security for my boy, boundaries no one would cross, and a life that didn't require me to trust with a blind heart. But justice, I learned, is not always about punishment. Sometimes it's about building a life so whole you can no longer see the cracks. The months that followed were salvage and scaffolding. I repaired what I could, learned to ask for help, and discovered that anger fades into practicality when you keep your child's face in front of you. People asked if I forgave them. I said no, not because I hated them in a way that destroyed me, but because forgiveness without accountability felt like erasing a map of what happened. I wanted them to remember what they'd done so they would not do it again, and so I would not be naive enough to trust without evidence. At the center of all of it, my son grew into his laughter again, unbroken and messy. He had a father who showed up, who made pancakes on Sundays and took him to soccer despite the ache that never quite left the edges of my chest. He had a father who would tell him the truth when he was old enough to understand it, not to punish but to teach him what honesty looked like. And in that honesty, I found something that passed for peace. The world reordered, and while it did not become prettier, it became truer. Quiet after truth is heavier than the truth itself. Once the words are out, once the evidence is named, everyone starts rearranging their memories to survive it. Anna tried to become smaller in the days that followed, moving softly through the house as if gentleness could erase damage. Eric did the opposite. He became practical, almost managerial, talking about schedules and money and what's best for Jonah, like logistics could absolve him of the audacity of living inside my marriage. I learned quickly that betrayal doesn't come with shame attached. It borrows confidence from proximity and wears it like a suit. I asked them both to stop coming to the house at the same time. I asked for space that wasn't theoretical. They agreed, then broke the agreement within a week, explaining it away as convenience. Convenience had always been their currency. The lawyer told me to keep a journal. Dates. Times. Who said what? I didn't want to become that person, the one who documents love like a crime scene, but precision was the only thing that made me feel sane. So I wrote. I wrote about the mornings Anna left early with a bag she said held gym clothes and returned with her hair still perfect. I wrote about Eric's sudden interest in Jonah's preschool, the way he knew the teachers' names before I did. I wrote about the messages that arrived late at night, careful, affectionate, coded, when they forgot that shared accounts sync. Each entry felt like a nail sealing a box I didn't want to open, but I kept going because the alternative was to float inside uncertainty and call it peace. My parents chose a lane that surprised no one, neutrality disguised as wisdom. Families survive worse, my father said, eyes on his plate. My mother cried quietly and asked me to consider forgiveness as if it were a switch I could flip. I asked them a question I already knew the answer to. If it were you, would you let your brother raise your child in secret? Silence answered me. I stopped asking. Silence, I learned, is not impartial. It leans. Eric asked to talk. He wanted a man-to-man conversation, the phrase men use when they think masculinity can smooth over moral collapse. We met at a bar near his office because he said neutral ground would help. He arrived early and ordered us drinks like old times. I didn't touch mine. He talked first, spilling a narrative that centered him as a helper who stayed too long, a brother who filled gaps. She needed someone, he said, as if need were a license. I told him need explains behavior, it doesn't excuse it. He tried another angle, something like remorse, something like regret, and then he crossed the line he had been inching toward all along. Jonah deserves stability, he said. He deserves both of us. The word both hit me like a slap. He has a father, I said. You chose not to be an uncle. Eric's jaw tightened. He said things then that revealed more than he intended, that he felt entitled because he had been there, because biology was uncertain. Because love, in his mind, was a transaction you could win by being present when someone else was absent. I left money on the table and walked out into air that tasted like rust. Outside, I realized that if I stayed angry, I'd be stuck arguing definitions with a man who had none. The custody hearing arrived like weather, inevitable, cold. I stood in a room with fluorescent lights and spoke carefully about routines and care and consistency. Anna cried when she spoke, and the room softened for her because tears are persuasive. I didn't cry. I told the truth in plain sentences, and the judge asked questions that cut through theater. When it was over, the temporary order felt like a pause rather than a victory, but pauses matter when the alternative is free fall. Jonah stayed with me most nights. Anna got weekends and Wednesdays. Eric was not mentioned by name. That omission felt like a mercy and a warning. Life reassembled itself in small pieces. Breakfasts became quieter. I learned to braid hair with uneven results. I learned the difference between the cries that meant hunger and the cries that meant exhaustion. I learned that a child doesn't need explanations for adult failures. He needs predictability and warmth, and someone who shows up even when they're tired. In the evenings, when Jonah slept, I sorted paperwork and answered emails and tried not to replay old footage in my head. Sometimes it played anyway. I let it. Pain processed as pain diminished. Anna oscillated between remorse and defensiveness. Some days she apologized with a sincerity that made my chest ache. Other days she accused me of punishing her. I told her punishment implies power. This was consequence. Eric hovered at the edges of everything, sending messages about clothes Jonah needed, about soccer schedules, about being included. I stopped replying. Inclusion is earned, it's not demanded by proximity or blood. When my phone buzzed with his name, I felt nothing like hatred, just a clean boundary forming where chaos used to be. Friends chose sides without announcing it. Some drifted away quietly. Others showed up with casseroles and babysitting offers and a refusal to gossip. I learned who could hold my story without using it for entertainment. One night, after Jonah fell asleep with a toy truck clutched to his chest, I sat on the floor and felt something new alongside grief: resolve. Not the brittle kind fueled by anger, but the steady kind that knows where it's going even when the road bends. The turning point came when the school called. A routine thing, permission slips, but the secretary asked if Uncle Eric was authorized for pickup. Authorized. The word sat there, innocent and loaded. I said no, then yes. Then no again, my voice catching. After I hung up, I realized how easily the world could mislabel relationships if you let it. That afternoon I drove to the school and updated every form with meticulous care. I added a note. I did not explain. Clarity doesn't require narrative. Anna confronted me that night, anger sharpened by embarrassment. She said I was trying to erase Eric. I said I was drawing a line around my son. She said blood matters. I said behavior matters more. We stood in the kitchen like strangers negotiating a ceasefire that would never feel fair. She accused me of cruelty again. I told her cruelty would have been staying silent and letting Jonah grow up confused about who told him the truth. She cried. I did not move to comfort her. Some distances are earned. Months passed. The legal process ground on. The house felt like a shelter rather than a home, but shelters save lives. Eric moved farther away, physically and finally, emotionally. His messages slowed. When they came, they were formal, cautious. He had learned, at last, that entitlement collapses when it meets resistance. My parents adjusted their posture, bringing groceries, asking about Jonah's day. My mother apologized without qualifiers. It mattered. On a rainy afternoon, I found Jonah sitting on the floor with the framed photo from my parents' house, the one that started everything. He had pulled it from a box and was tapping the glass with a finger. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing at Eric. I sat beside him and chose honesty that fit a child's world. "That's your uncle," I said. "He loves you. But I'm your dad." Jonah nodded, satisfied, and went back to his trucks. Children accept truths when you don't wrap them in fear. I put the frame back in the box and sealed it. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I wanted to remember without reopening wounds. That night, as rain traced lines down the windows, I understood something that felt like progress. Justice, for me, was not spectacle. It was the slow, stubborn building of a life that didn't require lies to stand upright. It was choosing my son every morning and choosing myself enough to keep going. The lie survived in private longer than I expected. People are remarkably good at pretending nothing is wrong when the truth threatens their comfort. But lies rot from the inside, and eventually the smell reaches places you didn't plan for. It started small. A mutual friend asked me, too casually, if Eric was helping out more now. A neighbor mentioned seeing Anna and Eric together at a school event, and wondered aloud if that was new. I answered with non-answers until I realized silence was no longer neutral. It was protection for a story that wasn't mine to keep. The first public crack came at my parents' anniversary dinner. 40 people. Long table. Wine flowing. My brother arrived late and sat beside Anna like it was natural. Like they were daring the room to question it. Jonah sat on my lap, sticky with dessert, laughing at nothing. Someone asked for a family photo. Phones came out. My mother gestured for Eric to step in. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I said clearly and calmly, "No." The room paused. "That picture is for grandparents and parents," I added. "Eric isn't either." The air thickened. My mother flushed. Eric stared at me like he'd been slapped. Anna whispered my name like a warning. I took Jonah and walked to the porch. People followed in whispers. The party never recovered. Neither did the illusion. After that, the story started changing without my permission. I heard versions where I was controlling, unforgiving, bitter. Versions where the affair was minimized into complicated feelings. Versions where Jonah's paternity was hinted at in ways that made my hands shake. That was when I stopped waiting for fairness and chose accuracy. I told the truth once, plainly, to the people who mattered. I didn't dramatize. I didn't editorialize. I laid out the timeline, the evidence, the custody order. I answered questions until there were no more. I refused to argue with people who wanted the mess without the responsibility of understanding it. The consequences arrived quietly, and then all at once. Eric's workplace found out after someone forwarded a message he'd sent from a company phone, careless, affectionate, time-stamped during office hours. He didn't lose his job, but the promotion he'd been circling evaporated. Anna's friend group fractured. The ones who'd cheered her on realized cheering required blindness. Invitations slowed. Texts went unanswered. Isolation has a way of clarifying priorities. She called me late one night, voice stripped of anger, and asked if we could reset. I said we already had, just not together. The custody review hearing came sooner than expected. New information mattered. Boundaries mattered. Patterns mattered. I spoke again without drama. Anna spoke again with tears. The judge listened longer this time. The orders shifted from temporary to structured. Primary custody stayed with me. Eric was named explicitly as a restricted contact during exchanges. The words were formal, unemotional, and permanent enough to change the map of our lives. Outside the courthouse, Anna cried into her coat. Eric stood apart, staring at nothing. I didn't gloat. I buckled Jonah into his car seat and drove home. There were nights the victory felt hollow. I won safety, not joy. But safety is where joy grows if you let it. Jonah started sleeping through the night. He learned new words. He called me from across the room with the certainty that I would come. That certainty healed something I didn't know how to name. My parents tried again. They asked me to forgive for the sake of holidays. I told them forgiveness wasn't the same as access. We negotiated. We set rules. They learned to follow them or miss out. Love adjusted. Love survived. It just stopped pretending nothing had happened. Eric sent one last message months later. It was long and careful and full of regret shaped like excuses. I read it once and archived it. Closure is not a conversation you owe someone who refused to give you truth when it mattered. Anna asked through her lawyer if we could revisit arrangements. I said no. Consistency is a kindness to a child, instability is not compassion. By the time summer arrived, the town had found a new story to chew on. Ours became background noise. I found a rhythm that didn't require adrenaline. Mornings with Jonah. Work that paid the bills. Evenings that belonged to us. The house felt like a home again, not because it forgot, but because it learned. I understood then what justice looked like for me. Not humiliation. Not spectacle. Justice was the permanent realignment of lives around truth. Justice was boundaries that held. Justice was my son growing up without secrets pressed into his hands. The last confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or at a family gathering. It happened in a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of place where drama feels embarrassing by default. I was comparing cereal prices when I heard my name spoken carefully, like it might break if said too loud. Anna stood at the end of the aisle, thinner, older in a way that had nothing to do with time. She wasn't with Eric. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that she didn't step closer. She waited, hands visible, posture small. I finished what I was doing before I turned. Control is a quiet kind of power. She told me she was moving. New city. New job. She said it like a confession and a plea at the same time. She asked if Jonah could visit more often before she left. I asked if she'd talked to her lawyer. She nodded. I told her we'd follow the order and adjust only if it benefited Jonah. She cried without sound, the way people do when they've learned tears don't change outcomes. She asked if I ever loved her. I said yes. I also said love doesn't survive contempt. We stood there while a cart squeaked past us and a kid laughed somewhere nearby. Then she said she was sorry, for the years, not just the ending. I believed her. Belief didn't change anything. Eric tried once more, too. He showed up at my parents' house during one of Jonah's supervised visits, violating the order with the arrogance of someone who'd gotten away with too much for too long. My father told him to leave. My mother didn't argue. The line had finally been drawn by people who hated lines. Eric looked at me like he wanted a fight or forgiveness. Maybe either would have made him feel less small. I gave him neither. The supervisor noted the breach. The next review removed him entirely. Consequences don't need speeches. Time did the rest. It sanded the sharp edges without dulling the lesson. Jonah grew. He asked questions the way children do, direct, unsentimental. I answered with facts suitable for his age. I didn't poison him against his mother. I didn't sanctify myself. I told him families are built on care and honesty, and sometimes adults fail at both. He accepted that the way kids accept gravity. I dated once, briefly. I learned what it felt like to be chosen without secrecy. I learned to walk away early from what felt familiar but wrong. Mostly, I learned that peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in routines that don't require recovery. Years later, at Jonah's school play, I saw my parents smiling without strain. I saw Anna in the back row, composed, respectful of the distance we'd agreed on. I didn't see Eric. That absence felt earned. Jonah found me after the curtain call and ran into my arms with the certainty of someone who knows where home is. In that moment, the story ended the only way it ever could. People ask sometimes if I regret not exposing them more publicly, not burning everything down. I tell them no. Fire leaves scars on the land that didn't deserve them. Justice, real justice, rearranges life around truth and lets the liars live in the architecture they built. I didn't need revenge. I needed my son safe, my name intact, and my future unentangled from betrayal. Blood broke faith with me. I chose to protect what mattered anyway. That choice held. It still does.